seeking to know the forms. The second is the objectivity of science and its influence on the Scottish realist tradition. And the third is the fact that scientific knowledge has instrumental value only, rather than being part of the search for truth and the contemplation of God. Okay? Now, with that, to catch the overall spirit, purpose, context of his thinking, what we need to do is to zero in more specifically. And two things that I draw your attention to, the negative side, the critical side of what he does, and the more positive, constructive side. The criticism is addressed at the idols, as he called them. Interesting religious metaphor again. These are the things that people take uncritically, like their gods. They are non-scientific influences in human thought. Non-scientific influences that have to be exorcised, cast out. And he identifies four kinds of idols: the idols of the tribe, the idols of the cave, the idols of the marketplace, and the idols of the theater. The idols of the tribe have to do with the influence, unconscious influences perhaps, of the human mind, especially in regards to what we take to be first principles, but which are inadequately secured. Here is the notion that there is some knowledge that is rooted in the uniformities of human nature. Innate, native, like natural law, and these idols of the tribe he rejects. There is no innate knowledge. There is no inference to first principles from what we know of human nature. The idols of the tribe he rejects, and the selections which you're reading will put flesh on these bones. The idols of the cave have to do with individual temperament. Individual temperament, that is to say, the personal atmosphere that you breathe in your own cave, which influences the direction of your thinking. This is something he wants to get rid of completely. He would be quite surprised, I think, at the sort of thing that William James or Friedrich Nietzsche are going to say around 1900. James, who talks of the difference that it makes philosophically whether you're tender-minded or tough-minded, because your psychological disposition affects the kind of philosophy you have. The tender-minded person is more likely to be, philosophically, with an optimistic view of nature. The tough-minded person with a more deterministic, pessimistic view, so forth. Or Friedrich Nietzsche, who talked about the way in which the will to power, the strong-willed as against the weak-willed, affect people's philosophical views. So that on that basis, what Nietzsche will do is to essentially bring to bear a racist psychology, the Volkspsychology, a psychology of the race, psychology of the people, and will try to characterize the philosophical outlook of the French, the Germans, the British, etc., in terms of the mentality, the temperament of the people. So the idols of the cave having to do with individual or group temperament. Now, I saw somebody over here. Who was it? Kristen.
I was just wondering where the names tribe came from, and I was wondering if cave was like...
An echo of Plato? Yeah, sure is. Very much so. We're shut in our own cave, you see. And inasmuch as emotion, temperament seems in part to be physically produced, then the cave produces its own emotional temperament. Tribe, I suppose he's referring there to the whole human race, its identity, so forth. Yeah, so you're right in suspecting that. The idols of the marketplace, well, of course, in the 17th century town, village, that's where everybody met on market day. That's where all the gossip went on. That's where the language took shape. The language which conveys all sorts of ideas, whether or not intended and whether or not known. And in that regard, what he's doing is saying that, that the idiom of the language has a way of instilling philosophical beliefs that may be totally erroneous. If we take it, for instance, that a noun stands for a thing, an entity, a substance, then we're going to give substantive reality to everything that is denoted by a noun. And think of where that sort of thing led people like Plato in their metaphysics. You see. So the idols of the marketplace. The idols of the theatre, yeah, that's where our games of make-believe take on a reality and a life of their own. So that's where our imaginative thinking is taken to be real. And so the theatre has to do with, philosophy, science, and so forth. And he distinguishes three kinds of philosophy: the sophistical, the so-called empirical, and the superstitious. And the way he's using the terms, not just two, but all three of them, are to be regretted. The sophistical philosophy, his example there is Aristotle. And it's there he makes those uncomplimentary remarks about Aristotle's kind of induction. You see, where hastily abstracted principles destroy the possibility of assured conclusions from syllogistic reasoning. Empirical philosophy refers to some of the science of the day, where there is too little careful observation, too little close examination, too little empirical work going on. And he has in mind there the work of Gilbert, who did some primitive sorts of work having to do with magnetism, the lodestone, and so forth. Superstitious philosophy is philosophy mixed with religion. Philosophy mixed with religion. And there he has in mind people like Pythagoras and Plato, who give a religious aura to what they're doing, so that their philosophy leads to some kind of mystical religion. And he much prefers Democritus. Now, you see, when you look at that array of criticism, you can see how thorough is his repudiation of the past. I mentioned on Friday the resurgence of skepticism in the Renaissance. Skepticism about past philosophy. Skepticism due to a variety of factors, the rediscovery of Sextus Empiricus, the breakdown of the medieval synthesis, the epistemological vacuum left with the Protestant Reformation, so forth. Well, here is Bacon, you see, reenacting that skepticism with regards to past philosophy, wanting to make a fresh start, just as the Reformers went back to scriptura sola, scripture alone. So Bacon wants to go back to the empirical facts alone, you see. But notice that he doesn't see any active relationship between philosophy and religion, the way the medievals did. Theirs was a synthesis of the philosophical with the religious quest, of philosophy with theology. Not so Bacon. It certainly isn't an integration of science and religion. The only tangency of religion to science is in telling you why to do science. Why? Well, it has a lot of instrumental value. It helps you to go about that cultural mandate, to restore in part the human condition to what it might have been, and so forth. So it's not the content of science that is related to religion. It's simply the purpose of science, you see. Now, why is that? Well, I mentioned Galileo. You see, Galileo suffered from those who wanted to integrate the content of science with religion. That's what got him into trouble, you see. And in the England of Bacon's day, in Elizabethan England, there had been a history of religious persecution. You familiar with that religious history at all? The Protestant Reformation hit really at the time of Henry VIII, who was something of a Luther scholar himself. When he died, his daughter Mary became queen, an ardent Catholic, and the Catholic-Protestant struggle was on. Well, there was a gap in between when his son, Edward, young guy, was king. Didn't last very long. Then Mary. Then Elizabeth, the Protestant, and the tables are turned, you see. And after Elizabeth came the Stuarts, James I of Scotland, Catholic, divine right of kings, you see. Then Charles I, who lost his head over that, so forth. So these were days of religious struggle, religious persecution. And it seems that what Bacon was very anxious to do, or at least happy to do, was to separate religion sufficiently from philosophy and science to provide some insulation from those who would persecute scientists or philosophers for religious reasons. Okay? He didn't want to be another Socrates, drinking the hemlock. Well, they didn't do it with a hemlock in those days. They did it with an axe. Yes. And there were those. Ever been to the Tower of London, by the way? I remember when we visited the Tower when our kids were